Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 15. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. The Arizona Supreme Court upheld the language of a 2022 bill enacted in the state of Arizona that would revert back to an 1864 law about abortion if Roe v. Wade were ever overturned. Well, Roe v. Wade was overturned. This case went to the Arizona Supreme Court, and there has been much consternation and teeth gnashing in the legacy media and on cable news about the outcome of this case. Let's discuss, shall we? Once again, I was wrong. The Shohei Ohtani story. Turns out that his interpreter was in fact embezzling money from him and admitted to as much in text messages to his bookie. That sounds all perfectly probable, right? As the police always say, thank God criminals are dumb. And finally, the Detroit Red Wings are making a push to enter the playoffs for the first time in a number of years. I haven't spoken about them all season, and I didn't want to let the opportunity pass, although that window for them making the playoffs seems more and more closed by the day. Thank you all for listening. If you're new to the channel, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. If you like what you hear and you want to support, This Is Why I Don't Vote is on Patreon. Let's do this.
Act 1, 5 minutes on the Arizona abortion ban and the Arizona Supreme Court decision upholding it.
I want to do a quick 5 minutes on the Arizona Supreme Court upholding an 1864 law banning abortion here in the state of Arizona. I had not planned on doing this piece this week. This is more of an impromptu piece, or one that I haven't scripted out as delicately as I normally would. I've seen a lot of reaction in the legacy media, particularly the New York Times. I've seen a lot of reaction on the cable news networks, particularly CNN, about how this conservative Arizona court upheld this archaic ancient law, framing the upholding of that law as some sort of partisan effort on behalf of the court. To be clear, the Arizona Supreme Court made the proper decision. They made the correct legal decision. If you want an activist court, a court that is going to both interpret and then create the law, you are inviting in an activist court that is going to both interpret and create laws that you are going to disagree with. You will have no control over that process because Supreme Court justices aren't elected. They are appointed for life, whether that be on state Supreme Courts or the federal Supreme Court. Quick civics lesson. Courts interpret laws, legislatures write and enact laws, and the executive branch enforces those laws. That is referred to as the separation of powers. In 2022, the Arizona legislature enacted a 15-week abortion ban before, keyword, before the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade, of course, being the law of the land making abortion legal. The 2022 Arizona legislature limited the time frame that an abortion could be performed to 15 weeks. In that same bill that was passed by the legislature and signed into law by the governor, there was a provision that said, if Roe v. Wade is ever overturned, this legislation, this 15-week ban, will be void, and we will revert back to the 1864 law. So the legislative mandate is clear. The court had no other option but to uphold the 1864 law as the law of the land of the state of Arizona pursuant to the way the legislation read that was enacted in 2022. It does not matter whether or not the justice that sat on that court was conservative or liberal, that they voted for a Republican or a Democrat at any point in their life. They were upholding their duty as judges. They were upholding their responsibility as members of the Supreme Court to interpret the laws as they are drafted according to their plain language. Trying to make this a partisan argument only demonstrates the extent to which the American people simply don't understand how our political system works. The legislative branch enacts the laws. They write the legislation and they enact it. The executive branch enforces those laws, so the executive branch has the opportunity to either approve or veto that legislation as it is written. It is the court's job to interpret those laws. The Arizona Supreme Court correctly interpreted the laws as they were written. Does the fact that so many media outlets trying to turn this into some sort of partisan issue reflect on how little the American people understand the political system? Yes, it does. Does that ability for a media outlet such as the New York Times to try to turn this into a partisan issue, does it reflect cynically on that institution as a news outlet, as a source of journalism? Yes, it does. This is where we have to wake up. As a population, as an electorate, we have to wake up. Wake up, many have in the state of Arizona. There is very likely now going to be a ballot initiative that the people of the state of Arizona can vote on in November, similar to those initiatives in the states of Kansas and Kentucky, where there will be an amendment to the Arizona state constitution enshrining a woman's right to have an abortion. Whether you agree with that or you disagree with that, specific to this segment, it's irrelevant. The Supreme Court of the state of Arizona made the correct decision, and it was not done in any partisan fashion.
Act 2, 5 minutes on how legal precedents make for partisan sadness.
Chris Mays is the Attorney General of the state of Arizona. Katie Hobbs is the governor. Both of them have come out publicly and stated that they will not, and by way of the force and the conviction in their tone, in any way, shape, or form, utilize the authorities of their offices to enforce the Arizona ban on abortion that was upheld by the Arizona Supreme Court. Being a resident of the state of Arizona, this has been a roller coaster ride of partisanship over the course of the last 72 hours. Conservatives have applauded the decision by the Arizona Supreme Court and then lambasted the decision by the governor and the attorney general, while you've got liberals lambasting the decision by the Supreme Court and applauding the decision by the governor and the attorney general. There is a long precedent in this country of executives, whether being the president of the United States or state governors, refusing to abide by the decisions rendered by state Supreme Courts and even the federal Supreme Court. Abraham Lincoln famously refused to abide by the decision in the Dred Scott case, legalizing slavery in all of the states of the Union, thereby taking away Congress's ability to regulate the slave trade in slave and free states, thereby also allowing states to have a say in whether or not they were going to be slave states or free states. Andrew Jackson was hell-bent on displacing Native Americans from the state of Georgia, creating the Trail of Tears. The Supreme Court of the United States disagreed with him vehemently, and although it's likely not true, Jackson has been credited with having said John Marshall has made his decision, let's see him enforce it, or let him enforce it. Brown versus the Board of Education was the law of the land. In 1954, the Supreme Court stated clearly that separate but equal is unconstitutional. A number of Southern governors immediately came out and said they will not abide by the decision. And what's more, President Eisenhower's administration did not press the issue. Jim Crow was still the law of the land for decades. Note, all of these cases that I've just cited have to do with civil rights, have to do with equal rights among citizens. The judicial branch issued its decision, and the executive branch elected whether or not to abide by it, whether or not to enforce it. Yes, there is consternation in the state of Arizona by the conservatives that the governor and the attorney general refuse to uphold the law, as they stated, to follow the law, to prosecute women who are having abortions, and to prosecute the medical providers that are providing that service. I've stated it on this podcast numerous times, and I'll state it again. Be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. There is a precedent of executive leaders, presidents and governors, not following the opinions, the edicts of the Supreme Court of the United States or the Supreme Court of their particular state. That individual decision is irrelevant. Once the precedent is set, you have no idea what you've unleashed. You have no idea what will come out of Pandora's box. This issue is not long for debate in the state of Arizona. It is highly likely that in November there will be a ballot initiative to change the Constitution to memorialize a woman's right to have an abortion in the state. So it will go before the people again. If the states of Kentucky and Kansas are any indication, it's very likely to pass in the state of Arizona. And I do want to qualify that statement. I didn't think that a ballot initiative in either the state of Kansas or the state of Kentucky would pass memorializing a woman's right to have an abortion in those two states. States I would consider more conservative than the state of Arizona. The partisan temper tantrums have no effect on me whatsoever, and I make this plea to you, dear listener, that they have no effect on you. The executive branch aren't heroes when they refuse to support the things that you dislike, and they aren't villains when they refuse to support the things that you feel justified.
Act 3. Once again, I was wrong. The Shohei Ohtani gambling story.
I did a segment about the Shohei Ohtani gambling story, and once again, I was wrong. Turns out this is not Shades of Pete Rose. It turns out that because his interpreter had so much personal information about him and was instrumental in setting up many of the accounts that Shohei Ohtani had in the United States, he was able to impersonate Shohei Ohtani on the phone to embezzle $17 million from him. That's right, $17 million in order to supply not only the money that he needed to continue his gambling addiction, and I guess it is an addiction now based on text messages that have been produced, but to also fund his lavish lifestyle. In reading about this story and listening to some of the news that came out via the Twitter, and I just have to throw out that it pains me that I have to continue to go onto that medium in order to get information. Turns out the government had many of the texts that Shohei Ohtani's interpreter had sent to this bookie in Southern California, and they were quite damning, basically admitting that he's terrible at gambling, that in order to pay for these gambling debts, he was stealing from Ohtani. This guy admits to his bookie that he's stealing money in order to pay for his gambling debts. By way of the indictments against this gentleman, Ippei Mitsuhara, probably pronouncing his name wrong, it appears Shohei Ohtani is completely innocent of any gambling-related charges, any IRS-related charges of having given money to Mitsuhara in order to support, I guess you would say, or to at least pay off his gambling debts. The story is still curious to me given the timeline. The fact that when this story dropped, Shohei Ohtani's camp set up an interview with ESPN so that Mitsuhara could go on and tell this story about how Shohei Ohtani paid off some of his gambling debts. I'd like to know the backstory of how that all developed. Was Shohei Ohtani willing at that point to go along with a story that he knew wasn't true in order to save a friend? A friend who had embezzled over $16 million, maybe close to $17 million from him? In all the once again, I was wrong segments that I've done, I don't know that I had as much justification for the things that I predicted as I did in this one, given that there still is no explanation as to why Ohtani and his camp set up an interview for this guy to go on and tell a story that they knew wasn't true, to have a person that they suspected or knew had embezzled money from Ohtani, to have him go on to ESPN and tell this story. It just doesn't make any sense. Be that as it may, it does not appear that Ohtani is in any way, shape, or form involved with illegal gambling, and once again, I was wrong.
Act 4. The perilous playoff predicament of the Detroit Red Wings.
It has been many a moon since the Detroit Red Wings have made the playoffs. But a month ago, I had high hopes that the Red Wings would not only make the playoffs, but might actually get out of the 8th seed, might actually avoid having to play one of the best teams in the East, and was tempted to do a segment on the podcast speaking to this, speaking to how that team, all this young talent, appears to be coming together, and they're making not only a playoff push, but they're making a push to potentially get out of the wild card spot, to move into one of the secured playoff positions. Right around the time that I'm writing out that segment, that I'm getting excited to talk about the Red Wings and their playoff opportunities, their playoff push, if you will, the Red Wings decided to stop winning hockey games. The Red Wings went on a streak of 6 straight losses. And I don't mean that they didn't win the game and then they drew, they got a point out of the draw. No, they didn't get any points at all. They lost 6 straight hockey games. For the month of March, they won 3 hockey games. 1 more than 2 and 2 more than 1. 3 total hockey games. During this stretch in March, they had one of their star players, Dylan Larkin, go out with injury, and they completely fell apart. In the month of April, as their playoff light dimmed, they had the opportunity to beat some of the teams that they were competing for that playoff spot. April 1st, they beat the Tampa Bay Lightning 4-2. They then unfortunately had the New York Rangers, which is now one of the best teams in the NHL, at least by way of points. They lose 4-3. They have a chance to play another team that has an outside chance at the playoffs, the Sabres. They win that game 3-1. And then they face the Washington Capitals and the Pittsburgh Penguins, 2 teams that they are competing with for the last playoff spot in the East. And they drop both games to the Caps 2-1 in a game that they had many opportunities to win. And last night, this being April the 12th, last night to the Penguins in overtime 6-5. The Red Wings have 3 games left to try to cement their spot in the East, in the playoffs. They're facing the Maple Leafs in Toronto, the Canadiens at home, and then the Canadiens in Montreal. Thankfully, the Montreal Canadiens are terrible, so they get to finish out their season against a team that one would believe they'd be able to take all of the points from winning both games. Will this be enough? I don't know. I did a segment a few years ago about the Chicago Blackhawks and all of the, I'm going to use this word, treachery. It's the word that just came through me. All the treachery that surrounded the Blackhawks in their Stanley Cup runs, with influential staff members using their position to have sex with players in their junior leagues. Shortly thereafter, I got rid of cable, so I didn't have access to the NHL for a good year. I mostly kept up with the Red Wings' progress, or lack thereof, via my phone, via all the sports apps, and the Red Wings weren't any good. So it wasn't like I was missing out on anything. Because it's such a great product, I couldn't stay away from the playoffs. So of course I came back and made whatever concession I needed to in order to see the playoff games. And then ESPN re-signed the NHL. If you know the history, ESPN has flirted with the NHL for decades, paying for broadcast rights for one contract and then at the end of the contract demanding such a concession that the NHL ended up taking other deals. Watching a few of the Red Wings games at the beginning of the season, the middle of the season, they played competently. They looked like a competent hockey team under the banner of the winged wheel. I was drawn in. Even if the Red Wings don't make the playoff this season, they had a good season. They had an opportunity, and given how young the team is, it's going to be a building block for them that they came so close and then saw it all fall apart. As Pat Riley has said, the coach of the LA Lakers, the New York Knicks, and the Miami Heat, this is part of that pain and progression, particularly for a young team. Say that 3 times fast. I wrote that out. I didn't think that it would be that complicated. Pain and progression, particularly for a young team. Although I also wrote out perilous playoff predicament for the Red Wings, and that didn't strike me as being difficult to say until I actually had to say it. I didn't want to let the season pass without making at least one comment about the Red Wings, and I'll probably reach out to my buddy John to do an NHL playoff preview here in the next week, given the fact that we're only 3 games away from what is, in my mind, week over week, matchup by matchup, the most exciting playoff competition in all of professional sports. Whether the Red Wings make it or they don't, I'll still be watching. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.